So today we're going to talk about utilizing specialized mobile strike teams for effective invasive species management. So let me confuse you a little bit up front, or hopefully I won't confuse you. Hopefully I'll kind of use this as an example, and maybe we can use the idea throughout the course of this presentation. There's always problems in different industries around the world, and one of the biggest problems is fragmentation. Let's just use the automobile as an example. If you look at an automobile and you think about all the parts, obviously these aren't all the parts, but they give examples. All these parts have to work together in order to have a successful car that can drive safely, can get you places, it gets good gas mileage, it does everything that it has to do. If you take away the brakes, this is no longer going to work. The car will keep rolling, it'll crash, it'll never work. You'll never get to where you want to go, or you might get there, but not safely. Take away the engine, the car is not going to run. Take away the seats, it's going to be really uncomfortable. Take away the drive shafts, obviously we're going to have some issues. Take away the wiring components, the car is not going to work. In this industry, there's many manufacturers of car parts, and whenever GM or Ford or whatever company is building this car, they have to go out and they have to find the ones that make the best parts, and they have to bring them together to form the end product, which is their vehicle. Now, if they miss a part, there's going to be problems. If they get parts that aren't well made, there's going to be problems. So all parts can't function independently. You can get your brakes, but you have to have the car to make it work. So take that idea and think about the industry that we're in, the environmental industry. I don't know if you've ever looked at it like this, but invasive plants are just a very small portion of a much bigger industry, which is the environmental industry. When people go up to Congress to ask for funding, they're fighting for that funding amongst many people within the same industry, maybe with different ideas. Maybe they're up there talking about pollution, maybe it's aquatics, maybe it's something else, but we're all up there doing the same thing. So just think about this industry being organized like on a brick wall. And the grout lines are connecting lines, and the bricks are each segment of the industry. So we've got name the industry piece, and it will go in there. Invasive plants are just one of those bricks. Invasive species are within that same brick too. So you've got that little component within all these other big players. Okay, if we're not working together, the environmental industry is not going to succeed. Right now, we've built a lot of really good bricks. We've got a lot of really good groups out there that are working on early detection and rapid response. Some great programs that are out there. If you want to figure out how to organize volunteers, do a citizen scientist program for rapid response, boy, do we have some good stuff. We've got some really good on-the-ground control. We've got resources that are wonderful. We have companies, we have not-for-profit groups, we have state agencies. They're all working on-the-ground control, doing a really good job on it. We have other companies that do restoration. They get in there and they do the replanting. They have native plant nurseries that just do great jobs. You can see, and you go down the list, research and development, education and public awareness. Each of these kind of represent one brick within our brick of the environmental industry. Now, right now we're just kind of a pile of bricks. We're just sitting there, very fragmented. There's several groups that are putting the bricks together pretty well. There's a lot of SISMAs out there, cooperative invasive species management areas. There's a lot of CWMAs that have been formed over the years that are trying to put all the pieces together. But ultimately, we're at a stage in this industry where the pieces really need to be picked up and organized and put together to make the industry work. Because without the restoration piece of it, the on-the-ground control won't necessarily work. Without the tools being built to support the on-the-ground control, then we might as well not be trying, because we won't have anything to do the work with. If we don't have good mapping and identification protocols, well, then we're going to be scattered and we're not going to be organized. So these are all just like that automobile example. Now we have our industry just as segmented. And if we put it all together, we're going to have this running vehicle that works really well. But if we keep it fragmented, we'll have a lot of good parts, but not one that functions as a whole. So our challenge, I think my challenge to you today is, how can you be part of pioneering this industry? This is not an old industry. It's been around. Let's just say it's been around since the executive order was signed around 1998. That still makes this about 15 years old. That's really young for an industry. How long has the automobile been around? How long have computers been around today? You know, take your computer and all the parts that are in it, you know, they have to function together to work properly. Well, we're in an early stage of this industry, and we are actually all still at the point where we can be part of the pioneering stage. You know, it's been said our greatest challenges can lead us to our biggest opportunities. You know, and I want to add to that, if we follow the correct course. So I think one of the biggest challenges we've had is funding, and a lot of the reasons we don't get good funding is because we're not organized enough to show that when we work as a whole, we're a lot stronger than we work as fragmented pieces. Alfred Marshall, he's one of the founders of neoclassical economics, has 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, organization. But his theory is organizing is the coordinating factor which brings the other factors together, organization. So by creatively organizing, we can create new commodities or improve the plan of producing an old commodity. Right now, we need to improve the plan of the service of invasive species management. So we're going to talk about doing this organization today utilizing the strike team model. So some of you on the line are very familiar with what strike teams or EPMTs or mobile strike teams are, but a lot of you aren't. So just really briefly, you know, my definition, just, you know, bulleted definition of a strike team is kind of like this. It's often based on a military strike team and wildfire management program. I think those are really good examples. They're mobile, they're highly trained, and they're expert targeted workforce. They are able, because they're experts, are able to promote efficient use of expertise and the limited resources they might have. And what they do really depends upon the organization of the industry. So I'm going to give a few examples of strike teams within our industry, and then I'm going to jump into some in terms of what our invasive plant control, my company, does with strike teams and how we're working on some new projects. And I want to show you how we're trying to take those fragmented pieces and put them together so that these strike teams can function in many, many capacities. So several years ago, we, up in Fort Detrick, actually at Forest Glen, we had a conference that was really focused on strike teams. And I invited several of the different team leaders from around the United States and had them just kind of lay out what their teams do and who they are. So I'm going to kind of show you some of those slides with their permission in terms of what those teams are about, to give you an idea of what types of strike teams, or in this case, exotic plant management teams, are out there. So Jill Swearingen was kind enough to come and talk about the National Capital Region team. You can see with the Park Service, this is an old map, and in fact, Jill was going to send me a new one. You can see the theory of how these EPMTs are spread out. So you have these specialized crews working in the different regions you see, plus some. And they're able to focus on their region, focus on their states, and really knock out invasive species with a really targeted effort. The concept for the EPMTs was long-term recognition of invasive species in the Park Service, basing it on that military strike team model and promoting efficient use of expertise and their resources, similar to the definition that I just mentioned. They utilize an integrated approach to invasive plant management. They cooperate, they inventory, they monitor, prevent, offer the treatment and control, the restoration. I think they're one of the best models out there of trying to take those bricks and put them together so that when they visit a site, when they leave, they've actually left something there that's really functional, that can actually be managed over the course of time. You can see just the program accomplishments through 2010. Like I said, this workshop was a couple years ago. So this has obviously gotten even better. Acres inventoried, 87 million. Monitored, infested acres they found, treated acres, and probably more parks today with EPMT activities out there. And I kind of want to show the challenges as we go through each one of these examples, because at the end of the day, this is what the challenges are going to be. And I think it's limited resources. Whether it be funding, staff, whatever it is, it all ends up coming down to funding. So that's a quick EPMT example, what the Park Service has out there. And they've got some great teams out there. And I also wanted to say really quickly, if you look at the teams and the makeup of those teams, there's some really, really highly qualified crew leaders, but the crews themselves are very highly qualified and great people to go to find resources about these strike teams. So another model that was presented was from Jenny Erickson, who's no longer the National Program Coordinator. She's working out in California now, but for the Fish and Wildlife Service. But her presentation was talking about the Invasive Species Strike Team program for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And their theory, which I think was a really good one, and I think is one we should really focus on, is that it's all about investing in prevention. If you take care of the problem early, the cost is a lot less than if you wait until it's a large-scale control. Their Fish and Wildlife Service strike teams, as you can see their vision here, contribute to the restoration and maintenance of native plant and wildlife communities and try to reduce the impacts from invasive species through prevention, control, restoration, monitoring, and education. Again, the package is there. They're getting all these components, all those bricks, and trying to put them together so that when they go in, they're not just controlling that patch of ailanthus. They're thinking about what's going to happen after they leave with that same patch. The goals of the Fish and Wildlife Service program is to prevent and reduce the spread of invasive species. They utilize outreach, education, partnerships. One of the projects we're going to talk about today that's being proposed for a 6-state area in the Northwest includes the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service teams. And it includes all of these components, including the early detection and integrated pest management. You can see when this presentation was made just kind of how the regions were set up for the Fish and Wildlife Service and where the different teams were located. And you can see how they're working to address the problems. And I think one thing that's key here in everything we're talking about today with these mobile strike teams is that while our teams are going in there and we're doing this work, we need to make sure that we're dealing with the neighboring landscapes as well and really focus, have this team have the ability to provide the education and outreach and the collaboration on projects. So another example that someone emailed me just yesterday and we spoke about last week is with the New York State Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation. If you look at they actually have a team that they've put together. Here you can see the Palisades Region Field Crew in 2012. So another example, we've gone from the federal down to the state level of, there are crews from state to state that are out there. This particular crew worked 1,500 hours on 80 projects with 18 species and 5 parks. And if you look at the price of that, that's pretty good. I think I figured that out to be around $12 an hour for that. Or excuse me, $12 an acre. Oh, no, per hour. Yeah, it was per hour. And you look at the species controlled, the person hours per species, you can see they got a nice list of species in that time frame that they worked. And 80 plus projects is pretty good. So by putting together a highly qualified team, they were able to get out and be very efficient in the work they were doing and do things that, you might feel a little uncomfortable doing with, contracting out groups you're not familiar with or working with, maybe some of these organizations that do contracts, they have to deal with labor that's really not skilled for the work they're doing. But with the right team, you can actually have someone get on a rappelling rope and go down into the ravine to work on something like Phragmites or maybe Paulownia along the edges. Another example of that same team is the 2010 field crew. So these are a few of the slides they were kind enough to send me. And I know they're on the presentation. Hi, guys. I'd love for you guys to do a presentation on this sometime as well so you can highlight it in a little more detail, the work that you guys do. You can see with 5 members from June to November, they were able to cover 62 sites, 27 species, cover trails, roads, backcountry areas, do mapping. And if you look at the monthly control totals, a lot of species controlled and a lot of stems taken care of. So the model really shows, the strike team model can really show you that from the federal to the state level, you can have a lot of advantages and really do a lot of control work. And I guess this is the 2010 expenditures that they sent. $69,000 for all the area that we just looked at. So about $1,500 per acre. Not so bad. When you look at charts and you think about the strike team concept, we do have to consider that often strike teams are going to be more expensive because you're talking about specialized labor. And these are not people that you're going to be paying minimum wage. You have to pay them to match their background. $1,500 an acre is probably a good average. That should be the average for strike teams. You're going to get into some infestations of multi-stem species where these teams are going to be, it's going to cost more like $5,000 an acre when it's just a high-intensity level 5 multi-stem population and you have acre upon acre of it. But that same team is going to be treating herbaceous level of invasive plants, which can cost as low as $10 per acre. So the average comes out pretty well, and you can actually get a lot of work done with educated labor. Another quick example is the Ohio Woodlands Job Corps. Dave Apsley came to the conference in Fort Detrick and kind of showed what they were able to do with some stimulus money. So they were able to create 132 jobs, job training for future work in forestry, and focus the control on invasive species. This was funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and you can see the number of workers they were able to employ with this funding. So when we talk about shovel ready, I think it's really important to be sure that, especially in these times when economics are pretty difficult for everyone, that we plan for these things. You know, if Dave and this crew hadn't planned ahead of time and really been thinking about what they could do, they may not have received this funding, and they may not have been able to go out with these strike teams and do the work that they did. They prepared by getting the herbicide, upgrading storage facilities, identifying priorities, and you can read the list there. Some of their key accomplishments: 3,200 acres of invasive species treated, reforested 175 acres. Some of the target species: ailanthus, paulownia, buckthorn, bush honeysuckle, autumn olive. And they were using all the integrated pest management methods, from basal bark to cut stump treatments. And again, in their case, the biggest challenge was funding. The initial funding was great, but what's going to happen next? How are they going to sustain this funding into the future? Be curious to get an update from them to see how they were able to do that. There was a lot of stimulus money put forth towards invasive plant work, and I'm afraid a lot of that money was spent on, single-shot projects, and then when that project was done 2 years later, the plants are likely going to be coming back. So those are some examples of other agencies, other groups, state, federal, that are doing some type of strike team model. Now, from my experience with invasive plant control, we've been doing, I'm going to give my examples now from what we do. We've been in the strike team business for at least 15 years. That's all we've done since we started our company. Both Lee Patrick and myself, the owners of the company, started this business by getting a truck and driving to wherever the invasive species were and doing the work on invasive plants. So the focus has always been invasive plant oriented. Nowadays, we have crews that cross all boundaries and work on many different species and projects. Over the last 15 years, we've worked everywhere from Tennessee to Africa. We've done training for port of entry inspectors in Africa. We've done cut and treat on privet in South Georgia. Basically, utilizing all these concepts we've talked about, but never really being able to push them all together into one team, until probably several years ago. So the examples that I'm going to talk a little bit about today are 2 pilot projects we're currently working on. Large-scale, multi-state, multi-land management projects, and utilizing mobile strike teams as the model. The first one is the Department of Defense Early Detection Rapid Release Strike Teams. Basically, their strike team's focus is on the EDRR species. And then we put in a proposal for the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council to do a mobile strike team pilot project as well. So the Pacific Northwest proposal, the goal here is to successfully merge all these independent pieces that we've been talking about, from early detection to research and development, mapping, education, all the components, get them together and have a strike team that's able to do these things, not just functionally, but financially. The grant that we've gone after there is very large. It includes, bringing in state agencies from Colorado. It includes bringing in the federal groups from the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We've got a nice array of partners. We've made it to the 3rd round now for this, and there's, a possibility that this will happen. But even if it doesn't, what is happening is that, a newly revised model is being built. And we're able to take this model now and really work on this and build on this for future projects. The DoD Legacy Strike Team project, we're almost finished with that. We're in our 3rd site with that, and we're doing 4 sites. So we're doing 1 site from the Navy, 1 from the Army, 1 from the Marines. And we're going to go out there and actually do the control on the ground. We're doing some SISMA training so that we can bring in the partnering organizations and neighboring land managers. They're going to be working on restoration components. They're going to be doing every single component we just spoke about so that they can actually show how it works when we're able to put all the pieces together. We're working with EdMaps to do that using online tracking tools, and we're building an online operations manual so that this doesn't end now, so that hopefully this gets funded in the next year or the next 2 years for Legacy, but if it doesn't, there are some components that can be built on and continue even if the current funding source goes away. So our strike team model, it all starts with the people on the ground. You're only as good as who's working on the ground. So we're really careful. Like I said before, if you're going to have people that are focused and understand all these different components, they have to be educated. They have to understand what they're doing. We can go out and just get hard laborers to get on the ground and do the work, but they're going to be missing out a lot on the components that really need to be taken care of. So we need to consider, is it necessary to have them have some type of college education in resource management? Do they have 5 years experience treating invasive plants? Education is really important for these strike teams. The team characteristics, not necessarily for the DoD strike team, but for some of the models we're putting together. We're doing a couple models for 2 other countries that may have funding to put these together as well, where on each team you don't just have a terrestrial team. You have one of the team members that's focused on terrestrial, one on aquatics, one on insect, and one on disease. So you've got it all in the same team. They're all licensed and able to work on any of the above. And that way, while you're out on a site and you're doing training, you're doing education, and you're doing control, they're able to work together as a team and do all that. You don't have to have 6 different teams to accomplish the same goal. We make sure that we train them. We make sure that they understand equipment, they have plenty of information and experience with what they're doing before they get out in the field. Just to give you an idea of the type of crew we're talking about for one of these strike teams, here's some of the job descriptions I just kind of pulled off of our information, just to give you an idea of what's out there. And I'll be glad to send you guys this if you want to put one together for a job description for yourself. First of all, I'll say this. With our job descriptions, when we give them to people that are applying for jobs, and let me say this, there are plenty of people out there that want this job. If we put something out there, we can get 100 responses, many of them that are very good applications to do the type of work we're talking about. We're constantly getting people sending in applications to do this. But one of the first things we do, which isn't really shown here, but on our description, is really try to scare them away. Talk to them about how hard this type of work is. Talk to them about how difficult it is to get out in the weather that they have to work in, the travel that's involved, everything that's involved. And if they can pass that test, this is all the other stuff that they have to do. The operations of all the different tools, understanding how to complete progress reports. A lot of this stuff is online now when they have to do reporting. Adhere to label instructions and safety guidelines. Ability to correctly identify all plants. In this case, this is the one for the plant person. All invasive plants with minimal review and discriminate invasive plants. Any vegetation, native vegetation of similar appearance. In other words, they need to know what they're doing. When they're out there working on a site, they need to be able to tell the difference between a native plant and a non-native plant. What's the minimum experience you expect? Well, in this case, we ask for at least 1 year. I think what we find is that we're going to get more and more people with a lot more than 1 year experience because you have these EPMTs and the Fish and Wildlife Service strike teams in Ohio and New York putting people out there in the field and doing this type of work. So we're getting a lot more educated people, a lot more well-trained people coming into the field. There's also the degree program that we're working with that you can get an associate's degree in invasive species management work. But you got to make sure these people are trained and understand how to do it. Just to give you an example of how we do it, we kind of hesitated for years to get into the Florida work. So we kind of stayed out of there because the plants are so much different. The methods were different. There's a lot of differences in how they do things in Florida and in other parts of the states. Well, in order to make ourselves comfortable, we actually sent our strike team down there. We sent all of our crew leaders and spent a week volunteering for, in this case, Tony Pernis and the Park Service. We also worked for the state a little bit while we were down there. We actually got our hands dirty doing it as volunteers and really getting to understand it. By doing that, we were able to understand that there really isn't a lot of differences other than the plants. As long as you know what the best way to treat those plants are, there's a lot of the same components involved. But we really had to go down and learn the identification and get to know the plants before we started on a project. So when we're working in the Everglades, we're very comfortable that the people out there know what they're doing. I'll stress this many times throughout this talk. We really, with our teams and our mobile strike teams, want to emphasize selectivity. So when we have guys and girls out there in the field, we want to make sure that they can tell the difference between the sumac on this side of the screen and the ailanthus on the other side of the screen, because we don't want them killing the native plant. There's been too many horror stories of, a contractor coming in and wiping out an entire population of sumac, or any other species that they shouldn't have treated, or going up to a waterfall and with a big backpack sprayer full of blue dye and just spraying this on the stilt grass that you see in the middle of the waterfall. In some cases, not knowing what they're even spraying, in some cases not knowing what's coming out of their tank, and also just doing it in full view of 20, 30 people that have come to visit the waterfall. Make sure they're selective, not only in knowing the plants, but in the methods that they choose to do the work. Is it Virginia creeper, or is it a non-native invasive plant that you're trying to kill? Is it Akebia, chocolate vine? What is it you're trying to treat? Make sure that if you're treating at a distance, you know that you're not treating the good plant versus the bad plant. So these teams have to be very well educated. And that's why we have the job descriptions we have, and we kind of go through the training that we have to put these guys through. Make sure you give them plenty of accountability tools as well. This is just pulled from something else, but to give you an idea, make sure the strike team's able to stick to their completion dates. Have performance measures to make sure they're doing the work right. Make sure that if your strike team goes out there in 1 year and they treat this privet like you see on the bottom of this picture, that by year 2 or 3, the privet's still being treated, whether it's with volunteers or somebody else. So one of the benefits of the educated team is that they can do the training to teach people the volunteers how to come back here and maintain this site versus letting it sit and just start to grow again. Just really quickly, strike teams obviously are mobile. They have to be on the road. So you have to think about the efficiencies of how they get back and forth. In our case, we use smaller trucks, F-150s. We have tops on them. We secure our materials in there as best as we can. Sometimes it's boats. Sometimes we have to borrow equipment, sometimes rent it. You're traveling. You can't just drag a boat or a large piece of equipment behind you all the time if you're going from Maine down to Florida in the same season. If you need a swamp buggy in Florida, we're not going to be sticking this on a trailer and hauling it up to Maine at the end of the day. You've got to have partnerships and groups that these teams can work with to get the equipment that's required. The strike teams have to be capable of not only doing the on-the-ground control, but like I said in previous slides, we want to put the bricks together. Well, one of the bricks that we're trying to put together here include the inventory and the mapping protocols. So they have to be very familiar with not just how to treat, a non-native aquatic species or terrestrial species. They also need to know how to identify them, put them in the mapping system, put together an online management plan if necessary. So some of the responsibilities that I'm going to kind of show you in the next few minutes are listed here. And I'll go through one at a time, but starting with education. Each team, each strike team we put together, whether it's for the DoD Legacy Project or it's for the Pacific Northwest one or any of the other ones we're kind of piecing together right now, we want to make sure that we're including the educational component. In order to do that, one really good way is to help the groups that you're working for learn about and start to develop cooperative invasive species management areas. And that allows you to bring in all the neighboring properties and neighboring land managers. You can see pictures of groups here that we've worked with over the years and we've built teams with over the years. ASISMA is a little more developed, And it might not be as developed as that. You might just have the volunteers coming out on a Friday to do some work or a Saturday morning. On the bottom here, this is a picture from many years ago in Delaware when we were working on kind of at the time they were just called weed teams, when Randy Westbrook was traveling around the country developing weed teams. You can see Dr. Efley and Larry Fowler and the guys from Delaware there. But, it's important that these strike teams can go into a classroom at night. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see, I believe that's in Arlington County, where our team had to go and speak with the local community. People come and they want to know, what is this you guys are doing? Why are you killing our plants? What are you putting down on the ground? Why are you putting chemicals there? Why is it blue? Et cetera, et cetera. And you have to have people that are well qualified enough to get up there and speak to these guys and give good answers, and make sure they understand, that educate them, not just give answers, but provide the education so that it's understood what's going to happen in the future on these sites. Sometimes take them out into the field, take them out in the middle of the kudzu patch and talk to them about it. So our teams have to be well trained as well, so you really have to stick to that component of the training program. The next step on that little chart was inventory and mapping. So here you can see Drew Gentry doing some surveys on one of the sites that we were working on. He's one of our crew leaders that's been around for several years, worked for the Park Service EPMT before he came to work with us. But very familiar, very educated on not just the on-the-ground control, but doing the surveys as well. There's one of our interns this summer that worked up in the Adirondacks, working for the Nature Conservancy. The team also has to be able to develop and implement and update management plans. There's another presentation coming up. I don't have the date right in front of me, but if you'll go back to our website and look for the IPC Web Solutions presentation, I'd really love you to see some of the new web-based tools that we have. And one of my favorites are web-based management plans and online safety plans, online handbooks. Everything's accessible from your tablets or your handheld device, whether it's your cell phone, whatever you want to use, could be your laptop still. But you're putting everything online now. So these crews, these teams that we're putting together, can take all that information they just inventoried, all the information they do on their site sheets every day, gets tabulated daily in real time. So you have a real-time management plan that no longer just you pull off the shelf in a 3-ring binder, but it's actually there at your fingertips. You can change it while you're standing in the middle of that invasive patch that you just treated. So they have to be qualified to be able to use these types of tools. These management plans are really good for developing different strategies. And I'll just say it over and over again. You can just see kind of an example of how it looks on your screen. But you can click through each section. You can edit it, cut, paste, do whatever you want to. If you just treated say you're treating some grasses that day and you're using manual methods and you're bagging them, you can put that all directly into your plan. You can show everybody on a daily level what you've been doing. And then your administrators, whoever needs to look at it, can log into the site in real time and see the same information to see what the updates are. Well, the strike teams have to be able to have tools like that to be efficient to do everything we're talking about. Because if they're going to be doing the restoration component as well as the control component, the education, and the research and everything, they need to have a good way to track that information and to find that information easily, readily available. So a really high focus, a strong focus for these teams is using prevention techniques. And I like to use this example from the Falkland Islands just to kind of show you how important prevention can be on your cost of your project. So the Falkland Islands, you think, well, we're up here obviously, and the Falkland Islands are way down here. Several years ago, they invited us to put a proposal together to control an invasive plant they had down here on the South Sandwich Islands. Now, obviously, this is a very, very remote area, and it kind of just proves that it doesn't matter where you are, the invasives will find that space. As you can see on the island that needed the treatment, this whole area didn't need treatment for anything. This was just, snow and penguins and everything you can think of. But there's one area here that used to have some type of military component to it called King Edward Point. And on King Edward Point, up along this hillside up in here, they had an invasive species that was somehow brought there. Cardamine flexuosa. So you can see what it looks like, and it was growing up and down this hillside. Well, they didn't obviously have the tools and equipment and people to do this type of work, so they called us and they said, guys, we need to get you guys down here to do the work. Okay, I thought, well, that's great. Now, if they prevented this, this is what they could have avoided. This is what it took to get down to a site like this. And we'll just kind of go through this timeline really quickly. And this is, with prevention, this would not have been necessary. November 24th, go from Atlanta to Miami. November 25th, you arrive in Santiago, and you have to spend 2 nights there because there's no way for you to get on another flight to get from Santiago to Mount Pleasant to Stanley where you need to go. So you're able to leave then on the 27th, have to do another layover day after you get there because you have to take a patrol ship to get to the island. You can't just there's no boats that just go there. I believe this boat went once a month at this time. And the gentleman, Mr. Christie, had to set it up for us. So we had to go through this patrol ship, get on the patrol ship, and it takes, how many days did it take to get there? It looks like we were cruising from the 29th to the 3rd. So you have a 4-day boat ride on a patrol ship with your crew to get down there. When you're there, you have to think about now, we're on the site, we have to think the strike team has to be, first of all, educated enough to do the work, understand the plants, having never been there. They have to have all the tools and equipment taken there that they're going to need to do the work. And then we also have to think we have to be capable enough of, if someone goes down, if someone gets sick, we have to have someone else there that can back them up. So you have to have enough people there to take care of this project in case there's some type of problem on the site. Because if you don't get the work done in the amount of time you're supposed to get it done, you're going to have to wait another month to get that patrol ship back. So in this case, they caught the patrol ship January 9th. This is all proposal, and they're able to come back, in this itinerary, eventually getting all the way home on the 17th of January. So you can see 7, 8 travel days, plus all the time that if you miss your deadline, you don't get that patch treated, it's going to take a lot of time to get back there. So this crew it would be very necessary for them to be able to do all of the above. All the bricks we talked about need to be taken care of by this crew, including what are you going to do when we don't come back next year? Who's going to do this management? Well, that was accounted for by saying we need to set up a training. So while we're there, we're training some of the locals so they can go in and do whatever work needs to be done from this point forward. So that's just a really good example of why prevention is important, especially with these strike teams. Just some other examples of prevention techniques that the strike teams focus on. Education, maybe they have a vehicle wash system that they have to have with them. You can certainly teach them about all these different components. Go to the Center for Invasive Plant Management website, and I think you'll still find some really good prevention information that Janet Clark put together several years ago, including some of this about aquatics. The strike team, the team that we sent, myself, Randy Westbrooks, and Randy's wife to Africa to do the training, we trained, I think it was 9 East African countries, port of entry inspectors, and some of their administrators. So they came to Tanzania, and we were able to go on board of ships, look at the ballast water issues, look at all the different components of what you have to be careful of on ships. Talk to them about why these guys taking these boards off the boat from wherever they came from, throwing them in a truck and driving them somewhere in the country was not a good idea for insects. The same team had to go in and do inspections, so we taught them about how to inspect cargo. You wouldn't believe the number of insects and animals that were just boxed up in the airport. But understanding that this team, whoever goes there, whoever's on your mobile team, has to do the education as well. Maybe it's signage too. Maybe it's just understanding. The team has to understand what's out there already. There's a lot of really good signage, a lot of good stuff out there that is up already, and we need to be able to educate other people that don't have this information. So these guys have to be familiar with it. Understand what's going on in the Everglades with the pythons. Use EdMaps. Utilize the I've Got One app if you have a cell phone that you utilize apps with. There's several apps out there. Some of the ones we built for our company are specifically for these reasons, for identifying and showing where things are. But prevention is, in part, figuring out where everything is and trying to keep it from going somewhere else. Maybe it's the ability of our team to show how you can use certified forage. Maybe it's, these twines are tied around the hay, and that shows this one's certified and another one's not. But it's really important for your crews to know the differences. make sure, like you can see me after I walked out of the site in Florida, Tony said, hey, check out your back. It wouldn't have been good for me to get in a car at that point and drive to another site. Make sure we're cleaning our personal field gear. Make sure our pants are brushed. Make sure if we've got vehicles that we're using that we're able to wash those vehicles. So make sure your team has the capability of doing that. There's certainly good examples of equipment that's out here. One interclean one that you see here is more for the larger stuff. Let's watch how this one works. So typically this is how we clean off the dirt and stuff from a piece of equipment. Say it just came back from overseas or was working on a site at a university. Well, Interclean has a little more powerful method that they use. They've got some really neat equipment, and it's worth looking at their website to see some of the stuff they've developed for the military and other groups for doing cleaning on equipment after you get out in the field. Obviously, we're not all going to be able to afford that, and you're not going to drag that along on these natural area work sites, but those are really good for some other areas. More realistic would be Sheila Kennedy's system, and another webinar that's coming up talks about her system and how you can take this portable vehicle cleaning system along with you from site to site, or you can partner with groups around the country so that there's one available in the different areas where you're working. And that way, when you're going into a site, you have this underbody spray wash pattern, and when you're coming out of the site, you can go through the same system and make sure you're not taking invasives in or bringing them back out. But the teams can actually have this type of stuff available. You could put one together for your strike team in order to keep the invasives under control and utilize that prevention. So prevention is a really important component. And then obviously we have to get into one of the more important pieces, and that's the on-the-ground control. Well, I'm going to also throw in there that if they're going to do the on-the-ground control, if necessary, do the restoration with natives, but always make sure there's some type of monitoring and maintenance available. So the mobile strike teams have to be able to do all of the above. They have to be able to have the RTV available to do the foliar spray. They have to know the seasons where it's best to go in there and do this type of work. Why does one chemical work better than another? What season is best to treat one plant versus another plant? And they have to do it not just for one site. They need to know how to do it in New York as well as Florida. So they have to have the ability to learn a lot. Here's a site where they might be working in Tennessee. I use this example for some other presentations, so if you've seen it, I apologize. Please bear with me as I just go through it really quickly. But one of our crew leaders, Paul Richmiller's team, one year went from the Adirondacks down to the Virgin Islands throughout the course of a season, a treatment season, which might be might be summer and fall. Starting out up in the Adirondacks, but he ended up down here at the Hill property. So he had to take RTVs and other equipment, and this Google Earth was good this time because they took a picture of this after the treatment had settled in, so we were able to get a really good idea of this is where all the fescue was, the brown spots, and you can see the areas that were missed. They obviously went back in there and treated it, and then the same team went back in there after the treatments and at the appropriate time and reseeded the site with native grass seeds all up through here. This is a virgin or an old growth forest back up in this area that was kind of hidden for years and years until just a couple years ago. So they treated bush honeysuckle. They treated Chinese privet, multiflora rose. They had to have the type of equipment necessary to do that. So they have equipment that's relatively mobile, like these ATVs with 40-gallon sprayers, maybe a 10-foot hose on the back. And then they're able to go through these sites and actually do these foliar spray with the boomless nozzle, take care of the work, and then, like I said, come back in later, not just doing the foliar spray on the ground, but doing the multi-stem species and the tree species and the vines. And then when they finish that project, pick up, move over to Arnold Air Force Base, work on the projects they have there. And of course, your team has to have licensing in all these places as well. So if we're working in Tennessee and then we're getting ready to move to Florida, they have to have their licenses in all the different states that they're going to be working in. So we make sure that the people we have are able to, first of all, take the test and pass the test and then really know what they're talking about on the test when they move from one site to another. So around Air Force Base, they might be working on a different plant with a different method, in this case autumn olive along the roadside, or multiflora rose along a fence line. From there, they moved on to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina, and they started treating a whole other slew of plants. You know, they began their season working for the Adirondacks doing stem injection and other types of treatments on, say, Japanese knotweed. And it was hot. It was the middle of the summer. By the time fall hit, now they're in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park working on cutting and treating Chinese privet or some other plant. So the methods change, the tools change, so the crew has to be capable of doing that type of work. You can see just one of our crews that Paul was working with that year. And then they moved to South Florida where all the plants are different. So they need to know, you know, the difference between the different plants from North Carolina down to Florida, and then they need to know how to treat them as well. They have to have the right equipment to do it with. So these teams are familiar with Brazilian pepper as well as the bush honeysuckle or the privet or lygodium. They're doing the treatments on all these different species, trying to make sure that the local environment is as intact as possible after the treatment. From Melaleuca control to the Brazilian pepper. And then the same mobile strike team has to have the ability, which they did, of picking up, getting on an airplane, getting equipment to where they have to go, and in this case working for the Park Service in the Virgin Islands National Park. So Paul's team went down there. In this case, they used a lot of hand sprayers and backpack sprayers and did a lot of work on different species like wild pineapple on Hassel Island or limeberry, African guinea grass. You can see the before and afters in some of these species 2 weeks after treatment. Tantan, snake plant. You know, obviously plants that they didn't see in New York, they're now having to be familiar with down there. So going back to that educational piece of it, that component is really important. Okay, so let's go to the next step, the native plant restoration. So once they've done this work, sometimes it's not necessary to revegetate other than to see what's going to come back. Many times that's the case. But if not, it's really necessary for that crew to be able to have good resources to reach out to the native plant community and figure out where the good nurseries are and find ways and methods to put the plants in after the fact to help restore the site. So that's another component of what our strike teams are able to do. Here you can see where we were seeding that site that we were going to be doing at the Hill property I showed you a few slides ago. And then one of the last ones is, again, to train the locals to manage the site. So utilizing SISMAs, trainings, workshops, in-house training, we want to make sure this crew is able to do all the above so that if we're not able to come back the next year, somebody will be there that's very capable of doing the work on the ground. There's a lot of ways that you can get them involved. You can get them doing EDRR stuff. You know, here's an example of a website or some apps we put together for the Fish and Wildlife Refuge System, doing early detection network for New England. You know, go take a look at this sometime, and you'll see kind of some of the ideas of ways that you can get volunteers involved in your program. So, about 50 minutes, and I don't know if I'm 397 slides in, but I imagine most of you guys have PowerPoint poisoning at this point. So I'm going to slow down, kind of come to an end. Suggest you take a look at IPC Web Solutions at some point, which are some of the tools we talked about. That has a lot to do with the equipment that's available out there to make everybody more efficient. So, like I've said in the past, you can either put together a first class, or you can pay for first class, or you can pay for coach class. You pay a little bit more to put together a highly qualified, specific strike team, but the results are well worth what you get for them. Now I'm going to end the talk there. I'll say this. If you have, let me just start it here so you can see my contact information. Take a look at our website. Take a look at the webinars coming up. We're going to be adding them, you know, pretty much weekly from now on. We're going to try to just keep this going indefinitely. We've got a lot of good people wanting to give talks, so we're going to start putting them on the agenda. So just keep your eyes open for different talks that are coming out there. And I really appreciate everyone coming out today. I'm probably going to hold off at this point because of the timing on any questions, and I'll send you guys some via email. Looks like there's a couple out there. And I will close it with that. And I thank everyone for attending.